Well, it's time for bed, isn't it? Come closer, my little history nerds, and let me tell you a story about ancient Rome. Now don't go thinking you're getting away with those cute little brains of yours. No, I'm gonna put them to work tonight. I am gonna make your gears grind and turn as we explore the wild world of Roman politics. But don't worry, it'll be easy peasy. We're gonna set the tone for this gentle exploration by establishing the year as 88 BC. And Rome is going through one of its many identity crises. And if that doesn't sound like a great bedtime story, then I don't know what does. The Roman Republic is being torn apart from within by two political factions: the Optimates and the Populares. The Optimates are the elite, landowning Roman nobles who have been at the top of the heap since the founding of Rome. They are the ones who have passed down their bloodlines through generations, solidifying their wealth and power. The Populares, on the other hand, are the commoners. These are the folks who made their money in the cities, and they've got a bit of an underdog complex. You see, the Populares didn't come from old money or influential families. Instead, they built their fortunes from nothing. Now, I know you're probably thinking, wait a minute, weren't the Romans all about that hustle? Wasn't building wealth from nothing kind of the whole point of Roman culture? Well, yes, but back in the late Roman Republic, there was a limit to how much money a person could make. It was almost impossible to advance past the middle class without pulling some strings. And no matter how hard the Populares tried, they were always going to be second best. So they began to resent the Optimates, feeling that their wealth and power were unjustly denied to them because of who they were. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't your typical haves and have-nots situation. The Roman Republic was hardly a fan of keeping people down. In fact, if you were born into one of the lower classes, you could move up the rungs and become a part of the ruling class. But it wasn't easy. It took a lot of grit, determination, and just a little bit of luck. So as the tensions between these two groups rise, we find ourselves in the thick of this political battleground where ambition runs rampant and power is the ultimate prize. This is the perfect setting to introduce our next character, Gaius Marius. But before we dive into his story, remember to hit that subscribe button. But Nobin on Marius was born in 157 BC in the Italian colony of Art, which today is modern-day Apis. His family wasn't poor by any stretch of the imagination. He had enough money to afford military training, and eventually he became a military officer himself, even serving under the great general Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Now, if you haven't met Sulla yet, don't worry, you will soon. For now, just know that he's someone you definitely don't want to cross. Anyway, during Marius's time under Sulla, Rome was in the midst of a brutal 3-year war against the neighboring kingdom of Pontus. It was messy, bloody, and completely overshadowed by another war taking place in the east, the one that pitted Rome against Mithridates VI, the king of Pontus. If you're not familiar with Mithridates, think of him as the Thanos of the Black Sea region. But we'll talk more about him later. For now, just know that he was the biggest pain in the backside Rome had ever dealt with, and Marius and Sulla had the thankless job of dealing with him. During the first campaign of the First Mithridatic War, Sulla found himself in a precarious position. He needed manpower, so he went to Rome to ask the Assembly of the Centuries for more troops. That's basically Rome's version of Congress. But when he arrived, he found that the Assembly had gone against him and given the command to none other than Marius. You can imagine how stoked Sulla was about that. He was furious, but there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't defy the Assembly's decision, so he had to swallow his pride and accept it. But let's be real here. Pride was practically a virtue for the Romans, especially for someone like Sulla. So this was a big deal. But after recovering from his surprise, Sulla did what he always did. He got to work and recruited his army, prepared for battle, and headed out to meet Marius. Upon meeting him, Sulla politely requested that Marius relinquish command so that he could take over. But Marius was having none of it. Refused. And the two generals were forced to work together, sharing command of the Roman forces. Now, normally, 2 heads are better than 1, right? Well, not in this case. Marius and Sulla were complete opposites. They had different opinions on everything from strategy to tactics to pretty much anything else you can think of. Their conflicting views caused friction, tension, and ultimately fractured the Roman army. But it also had a major impact on young Marius. Working closely with Sulla showed him firsthand the pitfalls of ambition and the cost of failure. After the war ended, Marius returned to Rome a hero. But despite his victory, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He knew he wanted more, but he wasn't sure what. Meanwhile, Sulla was appointed dictator, and when he found out that Marius had taken the tribune's office, which was traditionally seen as a stepping stone to higher office, he flipped. Sulla saw Marius as a threat, and he wanted to get rid of him. But before we get into the juicy details of Sulla's plan to destroy Marius, remember to give this video a thumbs up. Sulla's actions send shockwaves throughout the Roman world, causing political turmoil and violence. People are forced to choose sides, either supporting Sulla or Marius and their respective allies. And as the conflict intensifies, the fate of the Roman Republic hangs in the balance. It's a tale of betrayal, revenge, and the relentless pursuit of power. In 88 BCE, while Marius was serving as consul, he and Crassus formed a powerful alliance that allowed them to control the Roman government and pursue their own interests. With this new alliance, Marius was able to advance his career and gain even more power for himself. However, this alliance was short-lived as Crassus would betray Marius and switch sides to support Sulla. With the help of Crassus and others, began to build his own coalition of supporters and allies. This growing opposition to Marius would eventually lead to open conflict. When Sulla marched on Rome with his army, Marius fled to Africa to raise another force to oppose Sulla. In Africa, Marius met up with Cinna, a supporter of his who had also been exiled by Sulla. Together, they rallied troops and prepared to march on Rome once again. As Marius and Cinna approached Rome, the city descended into chaos. The opposing forces clashed in the streets, leading to violence and bloodshed. The Optimus and Populares took advantage of the confusion and fought each other's battles, deepening the divide between the two factions. Eventually, Marius and Cinna entered Rome victorious, ending Sulla's first term as dictator. However, Sulla was not finished fighting for power. He would eventually return to Rome and defeat Marius once again, cementing his position as the most powerful man in the Roman world. All right, little history nerds, it's time for bed now, and don't you dare try to stay up for the next video. You need your beauty sleep. Just set your alarms for tomorrow morning, and you'll be fine. But seriously, if you enjoyed this gentle introduction to the great Roman general Gaius Marius, then you'll love the upcoming episodes. So set those alarms and get ready for more adventures in ancient Rome. I promise you won't regret it. And hey, why not share this video with your friends? It's always more fun to learn history together. Plus, by subscribing, you'll never miss an exciting episode. Sweet dreams. We've said it before and we'll say it again. Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, actually, it was built over the course of several centuries, thanks to the hard work of countless generations of Romans who built Rome. But still, even if it did take quite some time, it didn't happen overnight. Similarly, the careers of many Romans also took decades to build. And while it might seem like Gaius Marius shot out of nowhere to become one of Rome's most famous generals, he too had spent years honing his skills before he reached that point. And today, let's talk about how he got started. This is to early life and family roots. First things first, what was so special about Marius's family? As we mentioned in our last episode, Marius was born into the gens Aurelia, which was a patrician but impoverished family. But don't worry, because despite being poor, they were still super important. The gens Aurelia was one of the oldest and most respected families in Rome. They traced their ancestry back to the mythical founder of Rome, Aeneas himself, and produced several important figures throughout Rome's early history. But sadly, by the time of Marius, the gens Aurelia had fallen on hard times. Throughout ancient Rome, there existed a wide gap between the rich and the poor. Even though there were laws against it, wealthier Romans often exploited the lower classes for their own gain. And while there were certainly poor plebeians who managed to make something of themselves, it was much harder for a poor patrician to claw their way to prominence once they had fallen. See, when someone is wealthy, they have all kinds of options. They can hire people to manage their estates while they go and do other stuff, or just lounge around. They can use their money to smooth talk their way out of a lot of problems, or simply pay people to solve those problems for them. But when you're poor, you've got none of those advantages. In fact, You have to work harder than everyone else just to get by. And this meant that for a poor patrician like Marius, it would be even more difficult to succeed because they had none of the advantages that normally helped people succeed. In Marius's case, his father had been forced to sell off most of their family property in order to pay for his political career. So by the time he was born, the only thing left in the family was a small plot of land and a few slaves. And so from a very young age, Marius had to learn that life wasn't going to hand him anything. He had to fight for everything he got. Now, it might sound like a terrible situation, but it actually turned out to be a good thing, because it made Marius extraordinarily determined and ambitious. And in his case, it really paid off. But his childhood wasn't completely devoid of advantages. You see, despite the fact that his family had fallen on hard times, Marius was still related to some of the most powerful people in Rome. So he grew up surrounded by influential senators and military leaders who told him stories about Rome's glory days and inspired him to follow in their footsteps. And while it might not have been easy, Marius used these connections to get himself into the best schools in Rome. He studied rhetoric, law, philosophy, and everything a well-rounded Roman man of action should know, and he excelled at all of them, proving himself to be an exceptional student with a remarkable ability to memorize large amounts of information. But he was far from an egghead. Oh, no. Marius was a true Renaissance man. In his spare time from studying, he trained with his sword, javelin, and shield, learning how to be an effective soldier. He also traveled all over Italy and even Greece, seeing the world and experiencing different cultures. And all of this provided him with a huge advantage later on when he became a general. Basically, Marius had all the tools to become a successful Roman, but he had to work twice as hard as anyone else to get them. And it was this drive that set him apart from everyone else. Now, aside from being extremely intelligent and hardworking, Marius also had another quality that helped him succeed. According to Plutarch, Marius was very charming. Not everyone could be trusted, so Marius was careful to keep up a pleasant face when necessary, though he didn't shy away from showing his true colors. While he could be charming, he could also be cunning and ruthless. For example, during his youth, Marius murdered a gladiator after catching him trying to kill him in the street. And that's a pretty bold move, because gladiators were protected by law while they were in Rome. But it shows us that Marius wasn't afraid to break the rules if it meant protecting himself. And in a city as violent as Rome, that was an essential skill. But it wasn't just physical danger that Marius had to worry about. Political enemies were just as dangerous as criminals, and Marius learned that lesson firsthand. It happened when he was still a young man. He decided to run for office and get himself elected tribune of the plebs. That way he could help the poor plebs get access to land that the rich patricians had been hoarding for themselves. But the patricians weren't keen on the idea, and when Marius entered the forum, a group of armed patricians confronted him and killed his bodyguard. Naturally, Marius drew his dagger and charged forward, killing one of the patricians and injuring another. Now, obviously, this wasn't exactly what you'd call a brilliant move. After all, he had just committed murder, and that was no small matter in ancient Rome. But luckily, Marius had two things on his side. First of all, he was a charismatic guy, and he used that charm to win over the crowd. Then he called upon the crowd to bear witness to his attackers, and declared that if any man of influence wished to come forward and defend the accused, he would gladly forfeit his own life. And nobody did, so he was acquitted. Not exactly a brilliant move, but hey, it worked. And Marius kept winning elections until suddenly his career stalled. He ran for consul, but lost against his rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. But don't worry, because Marius wasn't done yet. Instead, he took the consolation prize and became proconsul of the province of Asia. There he put down a revolt of slaves and earned himself the nickname of Magnus, which means great. Later, he returned to Rome and won another election, this time for praetor. And now he was ready for his big comeback. His next assignment was to serve as military tribune and legate in the ongoing Third Macedonian War. And finally, he had a chance to prove himself in battle. Sadly, though, his superior officers treated him poorly, which didn't stop him from doing his duty. And in 104 BCE, his efforts were finally noticed. He led an attack on a village held by King Perseus of Macedon and absolutely smashed him. Unfortunately, though, when he returned to Rome, he was once again passed over for promotion. But at least he had his reputation. The following year, the people elected him consul along with his old rival, Scipio Asia, and for the next 2 years, he served as propraetor in the province of Further Spain. And according to Appian, he used the opportunity to launch a massive slave rebellion. He freed all the slaves in his province and allowed them to march on Rome. Whether or not that story is true is up for debate, but it's a cool story regardless. After returning to Rome, Marius was elected consul again, this time for a second term, and he ended up spending the entire year campaigning against Germanic tribes near the Alps. To hear how he absolutely wrecked them, stay tuned for the next episode. Now, while we can't cover every aspect of ancient Rome in these videos, we do try to hit on as many topics as possible, and you'll find that you already know a lot more about ancient Rome than you might think. You've probably seen the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Roman Forum, and maybe even the aqueducts. You've probably heard of famous Romans like Julius Caesar and Augustus, and you might even know a thing or two about Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. But what about the everyday people of ancient Rome? What were their houses like? How did they travel around? What did they eat? And how did they bury their dead? Well, instead of finding all of that information through random sources across the internet, you can find it all in one place. And that place is Real Engineering. And that's where we leave off for today. Thank you all so much for watching. We hope you learned something new, and we hope to see you all again soon. This is the first in a series of videos covering significant periods in the life of Roman general and statesman Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Make sure you stay tuned for more content. 3. First, military experiences. Jugurthine War, 112 to 105 BCE. The year is 112 BCE. Rome has been at war with the king of Numidia for the past 2 years. So far, the war isn't going well. The Roman army keeps losing against their elusive and skillful opponent. Jugurthine, king of Numidia, is a thorn in the side of Rome, and he will won't stop until he drives the Romans out of his territory. Rome is getting desperate. They need a new commander. Gaius Marius, a seasoned veteran and recently elected consul, takes command. He brings along his experienced subordinate, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. This will be Sulla's first experience leading soldiers into battle. But it won't be the last. He would go on to fight in every major Roman conflict for the next 4 decades, eventually becoming Dictator of Rome. But we're not there yet. In TS Bido, we'll look at how Sulla gained his first taste of military glory, capturing the troublesome Jew and establishing himself as one of Rome's foremost military commanders. Let's get started. Sulla and Marius set off from Rome in the winter of 112 BCE. To take on Jugurthine, Sulla was given command of the cavalry and advanced guard of the legion, while the bulk of the army was placed under the control of Gaius Marius. But Marius wasn't happy with this arrangement. He felt that the most important job went to the inexperienced Sulla. When the two met to discuss strategy, Marius complained about being passed over for command of the elite troops and made it clear he was unhappy about the situation. Sulla knew he had to do something to prove himself to his superior. It wouldn't be easy. He was up against one of the greatest generals in history, Gaius Marius. When Sulla arrived at the front, he found a disheartened army ready to give up. Jugurthine had proven to be a frustrating opponent. For 2 years, the Roman armies had been chasing him through the mountains of Numidia, and they had nothing to show for it. Many of the soldiers were deserting the army. Morale was low, and the entire campaign was in danger of collapsing. If he couldn't turn things around quickly, Sulla's career would be over before it even began. He needed a victory. But how? There was no simple answer. Marius had tried everything and failed. Now it was up to Sulla. As he looked over the men, he saw only cavalry. There weren't enough infantry to support the cavalry properly, let alone mount an effective attack. Even if he could get more troops, what good would it do? The terrain was impossible. The Numidians were light infantry. They were perfectly suited to the mountainous terrain of their homeland, whereas the heavy infantry the Romans relied on was not. To win a conventional battle against the Numidians would be nearly impossible. But there might be another way. That night, while the rest of the army slept, Sulla rode out into the wilderness. He didn't know where he was going, but he hoped inspiration would strike. Suddenly, he saw it. The plain stretched out below him, wide and open. It was perfect for a pitched battle, but there was a problem. On the other side of the valley was a high mountain ridge. From here, Jugurtha could easily observe any movement on the plain below. Unless Sulla could find a way to conceal his approach, Jugurtha would see him coming and slip away once again. It didn't seem possible, but then he saw it. There was a cave in the mountainside that might just work. He raced back to camp, woke up Marius, and told him his plan. The idea was simple. They would hide their army in the cave and wait for Jugurtha to pass by. Then they would charge out and surprise him. But would it work? Marius wasn't convinced. He agreed to the plan, but only because he had nothing to lose. Sulla led his cavalry to the cave. They hid there 3 days, eating only dry rations so they wouldn't attract any attention. When they finally emerged from the cave, Sulla's men were famished and exhausted. Still, they had to maintain their discipline. If they weren't completely silent, Jugurtha would hear them and escape once again. At last, after 3 long days, the men heard the sound of drums in the distance. Jugurtha was passing by. Every man held his breath as Sulla's cavalry charged out of the cave. With a shout, they raced across the plain. In the distance, Jugurtha's rider saw the horsemen charging towards them and tried to flee. It was too late. Sulla's cavalry reached the river bank before Jugurtha's men could cross. Turning back was impossible. They were trapped. Sulla ordered his men to halt. He sent a trumpet player forward. The riderless trumpets blared across the plain. Jugurtha's men froze in their tracks. They knew surrender was futile. Sulla offered them a choice: either commit mass suicide or surrender and live out the remainder of their days as slaves. One of Jugurtha's generals, Balchus, convinced the others to accept Sulla's offer. They laid down their weapons and awaited their fate. Sulla had won his first major battle. Soon, the news reached Rome. People celebrated in the streets. The Senate was ecstatic. They awarded Sulla with a triumph, the highest honor the Romans could bestow. It was only the second time in history that a cavalry commander had been awarded such a great honor. Sulla was famous. Gaius Marius was less enthusiastic. Despite the victory, he didn't think it was worth celebrating. In his mind, all Sulla had done was stumble upon an enemy who was already defeated. Marius believed he deserved the credit for the victory, not Sulla. This didn't set well with the young general. Why should he be overshadowed by his older, less talented colleague? Sulla decided he had enough. He left the army and returned to Rome. He was done serving under Marius. It wasn't long before Rome called on Gaius Marius. Once again, King Jugurtha had fled to the hills, and Rome needed its best general to finish the job. But Marius refused. He was sick and tired of fighting you. This was lucky for Sulla. If Marius had accepted the call, Sulla would have likely been passed over for command once again. But now, the door was open for him to step through. Once again, Sulla found himself on his way to North Africa. This time, he was in charge. Sulla proved to be a capable commander. He tracked down Jugurtha's forces and engaged them in battle. He pursued the Numidian king all over the countryside, slowly but surely forcing him back towards his capital city. The whole time Jugurtha desperately sought peace talks with Sulla, but the Roman was having none of it. He wanted the king's head. Finally, Jugurtha was cornered in his own capital city. There was nowhere else to run. Sulla ordered his men to build siege works and began investing the city. Days turned into weeks. The siege dragged on, and the Roman army grew restless. Sulla knew he had to end the siege soon, or his men would mutiny. Then he got his chance. A group of Numidians broke out of the city in the middle of the night. They fled to Sulla's camp seeking asylum. Sulla offered them a deal. If they surrendered the city, he would spare their lives. But if they tried to flee, he would kill them. The Numidians chose to surrender. The following day, Sulla entered Jugurtha's capital city. He took the royal palace and put it to the torch. He burned the king's treasure and destroyed his monuments. The war wasn't over yet. There were still pockets of resistance in the countryside. But Jugurtha was dead. The rest didn't matter. Sulla had captured Rome's most dangerous enemy and established himself as one of Rome's greatest heroes. By in Rome, people lined the streets, To celebrate Sulla's return, they cheered his name and praised his accomplishments. But not everyone was happy for him. The memory of Marius still stung. Sure, Marius had been awarded a triumph for his role in the war, but he was overlooked when it came time to distribute the spoils of war. The fact that Sulla had bested his old mentor and captured Jugurthine while he was away had yet been lost on the Roman people. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla would only grow with time. So ends the third episode in the life of Lucius Cornelius Sulla. In our next installment, we'll see Sulla serve under Marius once again in the social war. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more content. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Rome's Italian allies had long provided auxiliary troops for the Roman army, but they were tired of being second-class citizens. Now they want representation in the Roman Senate, and an end to Rome's imperialistic foreign policy that only brought them more enemies. But the Roman elite weren't interested in compromise. So in 91 BCE, the Italian allies rose up in open rebellion, kicking off the most devastating war in Roman history. This is episode 4 of our series on the Italian social war, where we will see how Rome almost broke itself apart. And remember, at the end of this episode, we'll do a Q&A session based on your questions from last week, so make sure you send those in. In 92 BCE, Rome found itself at war with a coalition of its Italian allies who wanted full citizenship. The conflict would become known as the Social War because the Romans were fighting against their allies, and Rome was indeed very much a society divided over how to handle this crisis. The rich landowners who dominated the Roman Senate were reluctant to come to terms with the allies. They feared that granting citizenship to these new allies would dilute the power of the Roman citizens and ruin the Republic. But there was also a growing faction within the Senate that believed compromise was necessary to preserve the unity of the state. The first year of the war went badly for Rome. Its armies simply couldn't cope with the guerrilla tactics of the allies, and so in 90 BCE, the Senate made a desperate move to turn things around. They put former consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla into command of the entire Roman army with the goal of crushing the rebellion once and for all. Though he was old enough to be eligible for the prestigious title of censor, Sulla instead chose to take the field as a general, donning the purple-striped toga of the imperator, which designated him as commander of the armies. Unlike many of his patrician colleagues, Sulla was a brilliant tactician and an even more brilliant politician. He would go on to earn his first consulship, largely due to the success he enjoyed during this war. Sulla began by putting down a revolt in the Samnite region of central Italy, then set his sights on the wealthy merchant class of the Italian south, hoping to make an example of them. In 89 BCE, he invaded Sicily, but he was met by Gaius Flamininus, who commanded the allied forces. Although outnumbered, Sulla positioned his troops at the edge of a narrow valley and baited the allies to attack. When Tadid unleashed a devastating volley from his cavalry, who were positioned on the hills overlooking the valley. It was a brilliant maneuver, but it almost ended in disaster. For just as the Roman cavalry were about to deliver the killing blow, Flamininus rallied his men and launched a counterattack. The resulting melee was one of the bloodiest of the entire social war, but eventually the allied troops were pushed back and Flamininus barely escaped with his life. Emboldened by his victory, Sulla decided to push on. He moved north to invade Greece, where the allies had established a naval base at the Isthmus of Corinth. After defeating several smaller allied forces, Sulla laid siege to the city of Athens. This, too, proved to be a difficult task, as the allies had fortified the city and were prepared for a long siege. But after 6 months, Sulla's superior numbers prevailed, and the city fell. Sulla used the spoils of war to great effect, shipping the riches back to Rome to bolster its treasury and win political support for himself. Meanwhile, the allies were regrouping under a new leader, Gaius Marius. We've told you about Marius before. He came from a new breed of Roman politician who claimed to represent the common people or plebs. While the patricians could trace their lineage back to the founders of Rome, Marius was the first of his gens to achieve prominence in Roman politics, and he owed his initial rise to power to nothing more than sheer force of personality and military talent. He was first elected tribune of the plebs in 107 BCE, and in that role, he protected the interests of the poor against the rich. Then he went on to serve 5 times as consul, which made him, along with Sulla, the most popular politician in Rome. But now he and Sulla were on opposite sides of the conflict. While Sulla had achieved stunning victories in the field, he wasn't yet ready to end the war. He wanted to make sure Rome was ready to deal with any future conflicts, and so he spent the next few years building up the Roman military machine, training new recruits, and conquering new lands. By 88 BCE, he had defeated the allies in southern Italy and pushed them out of Sicily and Greece. Now, he planned to finish the job once and for all. He assembled a massive force of nearly 90,000 foot soldiers and 6,000 cavalry, the largest field army Rome had ever assembled, and marched on the heartland of the Italian allies. His plan was to march through Etruria and attack the allies' main base at Asculum, where he would meet up with 2 other Roman armies coming from the south. But when he got to Etruria, he discovered that Marius had beaten him to the punch, and now Marius was encamped near Asculum with an army of 85,000 foot soldiers and 7,000 cavalry. It looked like the 2 Roman generals were headed for a collision course. Back in Rome, the Senate sided with Sulla, giving him the authority to raise an army of 150,000 men to crush the allies once and for all. But things didn't go according to plan, for when Sulla arrived on the battlefield, he realized that Marius had taken the hills, overlooking the Roman camp. And so, Sulla did the only thing he could do. He ordered his troops to attack head-on. The resulting battle was another violent affair, but in the end, neither side could claim a decisive victory. And so the stage was set for an extended siege. But before either side could dig in, an envoy from Marius arrived with a surprising message. He was offering Sulla a chance to end the war without bloodshed. Marius wanted to divide the spoils of war with Sulla. In effect, he was inviting Sulla to help him loot the allied cities and divide the plunder among themselves. And to sweeten the deal, he was offering Sulla a place at his side in the new Roman government he envisioned creating in the wake of the war. But Sulla turned it down, believing that if he agreed, he would be signing his own death warrant. And so the 2 Roman generals prepared for a long siege. But they never got the chance to fight it out, because in the middle of the night, Marius's army was routed. No one is sure what happened, but according to Plutarch, the Roman camp was filled with poisonous snakes, which unleashed a deadly plague upon the troops. Whatever the reason, most of Marius's men died, leaving him no choice but to sue for peace. And Sulla was willing to grant it, but not before extracting a pound of flesh. When he and Marius met to discuss the terms, Sulla accused Marius of murdering his friend and fellow consul, Gaius Flaminianus, at the start of the war. He demanded that Marius's property be confiscated, and that he himself be given command of Marius's legions. Most surprisingly, though he granted amnesty to all of the allies, including Marius, and offered them Roman citizenship. But while this treaty may have preserved the Roman Republic, it sowed the seeds of rivalry between Sulla and Marius, which would grow over the next decade until it exploded into civil war. So let's get to some of your questions from last week. Question number 1, from MESRUTONIS. What was the outcome of the siege of Carthage? You mean the Third Punic War, right? Well, as we discussed last week, Rome sacked Carthage, killed Hannibal, and then left the city depopulated, and in ruined statues in 146 BC. Carthage would never recover, and in fact, the site of the city was even plowed under by the Romans to remind everyone that Carthage was no more. Question number 2, from Vanya. You mentioned that Rome received a large influx of gold from the east, but it seems odd that the kings of Pontus and Bithynia were willing to give away so much wealth to Rome. Can you elaborate? You're thinking of the First Mithridatic War, right? Well, you're right. It does seem strange that Mithridates wouldn't use the money to build up his own kingdom. But remember, Mithridates was really afraid of Rome. So he tried to curry favor with them by giving them gifts. Think of it like paying protection money to a mobster. Plus, Rome was already on the verge of civil war, and if Mithridates wanted to expand his own power, he needed Rome distracted. Question 3, from JD. Did King Tigranes the Great ever regret accepting Pontic rule over Armenia? Well, probably. The further Tigranes expanded Pontic influence in the east, the more he came into conflict with Rome. And although Rome was in the midst of civil war, they still managed to send an army into Armenia to drive the Ponts out. So I would say yes, he probably regretted it. Alright everybody, that's it for this episode. Do you want forget to leave your questions in the comments below, and we'll get to those next week. Remember to subscribe if you aren't already, and join us next time as we continue our series on the fall of the Roman Republic. A new challenger has entered the arena, and he's got his sights set on the east. Rome's old enemy Mithridates, the Great. He's back with a vengeance. And in this video, we're going to explore how the Senate was prepared to let him go unchecked. But first, I need you to subscribe if you haven't already, so you never miss an upload. So in the last video, we ended our story in 88 BC, with the First Mithridatic War having just kicked off after Sulla successfully maneuvered himself into becoming the consul. And now the Roman Senate had to figure out who would get the command in the east against Mithridates. It was a question that would pit patrician against plebeian, optimate against populares, and it would also set the stage for civil war. Sulla was the leading candidate for the command because of his recent success, and while some people like Gaius Norbinus thought that the experienced and steady Marcus Livius Drusus might be a better choice, the majority of senators favored Sulla. They even went so far as to pass a resolution granting him the command. But when they put the motion to a vote, it failed by only one vote. The resolution passed by one vote. But it didn't help Sulla because that same day the tribunes of the plebs blocked the resolution. Now the tribunes were elected by the plebs, so they represented their interests. And right now, the plebs were solidly behind Marius. The two most powerful men in Rome, Sulla and Marius, both wanted the command. And the question was, how much influence did each of them have over the other branches of government? And if you've been watching this series from the beginning, you know where this is headed. This is a battle between two power bases. Marius and the populares had the support of the tribunes, while Sulla and the optimates controlled the Senate. This was a clash between two powers which would culminate in civil war, and this fight over the command was the opening salvo. So let's take a deeper look at these two branches of government, the Senate and the tribunes, and see how they operated. First up, the Senate. As we've said before, the Senate was made up of elder statesmen. These were former magistrates who had held offices like aedile, praetor, and consul. In theory, they had prestige and power because they represented the most influential families in Rome. In practice, however, they really only had the power to advise. They couldn't raise troops, they couldn't declare war, and they couldn't make treaties. That was all left up to the magistrate holding the imperium. But there was one thing that the Senate did have control over, and that was the appointment of generals. If the Senate could agree on a general, then he could have the resources and the authority to do all those things. The trouble was, the Senate wasn't very good at making decisions. In 89 BCE, there were two consuls, Lucius Cornelius Sulla and Gaius Marius. Since they were co-consuls, they each got one province, with the province of Asia Minor going to Sulla. Now, normally, the consuls didn't have to worry about defending their provinces. Those duties were given to the propraetors, the governors of the provinces, and then the consuls could focus on whatever else needed their attention. But because of the ongoing war in Asia Minor, Sulla's province was on the border of the war zone, so he was tasked with putting together a force to defend it. So his job was to assemble and train an army and then send it to the border under the command of a In theory, that is what Sulla should have done. And actually, he did exactly that. He raised 5 legions and sent them out to the province of Asia with the experienced general, Quincus Caecilius Metellus, and then kept on campaigning against the Greek kingdoms in the west. But the Senate was none too pleased about this. Metellus was an old rival of Sulla, and they suspected he might just defect and start campaigning on his own account. So the Senate ordered Sulla to recall Metellus and replace him with someone more loyal, like Lucius Cornelius Sulla. So instead of fighting the Greeks, Sulla was forced to fight the Senate. He refused to recall Metellus, and even threatened to march on Rome with Cinna. Meanwhile, back in the east, Mithridates was doing pretty well. His son, Archelaus, was on the march through Asia Minor, taking cities like Sardis, Philadelphia, and Halleck. So while Sulla was posturing in the west, Rome was getting clubbered in the east. So finally the Senate backed down and gave Sulla the command in the east. But the story doesn't end there. You see, the Senate had no way of enforcing its will outside of Rome itself. The only way they could wield power was by giving it to somebody, like appointing a magistrate or confirming a treaty. But if that magistrate or commander wasn't willing to do what the Senate wanted, they were powerless. That's why the Senate appointed Sulla in the first place. They knew he was ambitious and independent-minded, but they figured that if it came down to it, he would side with them. But Sulla was proving to be more difficult than they expected, so they tried again to give the command to someone more pliable. First to Norbanus, and then to Sina. When that failed, they brought in the heavy artillery. Marius was immensely popular with the common folk. He had rescued the Roman state in the social war, and he was credited with winning 3 major battles, even though he didn't really do much in any of them. But it was his political savvy and his ability to work the streets of Rome that made him famous. Unfortunately, he was also immensely disliked by the Roman nobility, and that was because he wasn't one of them. He came from a family of modest means, and he was the first person of new wealth to become consul. He rose to power because of his popularity with the people, and that was seen as a threat to the old order. Marius was everything that the elite Romans were not. He was a soldier's general who had risen through the ranks, not a rich aristocrat. He was a man of humble origins, not patrician blood, and he was beholden to the people, not the Senate. So when it came time to give the command in the East, they tried to keep him out of it. But his popularity with the people made that impossible. The tribunes were still under the thumb of the populares faction, and they threw every obstacle they could in Sulla's way, like blocking his command with a veto. And there was one thing that really irked him. While Sulla was fighting in Greece, Rome was being overrun by land-hungry Britons. This wasn't anything new. Rome was surrounded by thieves and robbers, but normally the magistrates took care of it. But because Sulla was busy in Greece, the problem was ignored, and it drove the tribunes crazy. So when the Senate gave the command to Marius, they were happy to oblige. The Senate was furious. They accused the tribunes of abusing their power, but they weren't able to stop them. And that left Sulla with a choice. He could try to fight his way into Rome to assert his authority, or he could leave Rome and try to secure his power base elsewhere. And we know which option he chose. This whole situation is a great example of how the system worked. Both the Senate and the tribunes had their strengths and weaknesses, but neither one could operate independently. Both branches of government depended on the will of the people, and that's why Marius was so popular. He was able to play the people against the Senate, and the Senate against the people, and he always came out on top. That's why he was the leading contender for this command. And it's also why Sulla had to leave Rome and go and conquer territory in the West. We'll explore how that happened next time. So until then, remember to subscribe if you haven't already and check out these other videos. He was supposed to be the hero, but now he's marching on the city. What did he do? In 88 BC, a Roman general named Sulla made his legions march on Rome. But why? To answer that question, we have to go back to the beginning. This is Rome, not the city, but the Republic, and it's about to get real. The year is 91 BC, and Rome has just finished fighting a brutal 3-year war against a coalition of Italian tribes known as the Social War. Most of the fighting was done by Rome's new professional army, an elite fighting force composed entirely of non. This practice of giving land and citizenship to loyal soldiers after campaigns had been going well for decades, even centuries. But with the Social War being such a bloody and costly affair, the Senate decided to change the policy. Soldiers who fought in the war would no longer receive citizenship. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a respected general who had actually begun the war by attacking the Samnites, was furious. He thought breaking this sacred tradition would hurt the morale of his troops and embolden their enemies. So he went to the Senate to complain. But when they wouldn't listen, he did something crazy. He took his legions and marched them straight to Rome. The citizens were shocked. Hadn't Sulla just come from a triumphant victory in the south? Why was he bringing his victorious army to the gates of the city? Was he planning to attack Rome? Well, yes, he was. But that wasn't the plan. Sulla had actually been ordered to march his army into Asia Minor to take on yet another war. But instead of obeying, he turned his troops around and came straight back to Italy, knowing full well that any soldier who deserted their post without orders was technically guilty of mutiny. And if anyone could punish them, it was him. The Senate couldn't believe their eyes. Could this really be happening? A Roman general turning his legions on the city itself. It was unheard of, unthinkable. In fact, It would become one of the most famous betrayals in all of Roman history. After spending several years fighting, killing, and dying in distant lands, the last thing those soldiers wanted to do was fight each other. But Sulla knew what he was doing. His troops weren't battle-hardened, cynical killers. They were Roman citizens. And Roman citizens had rights. And in Rome, the people were supreme. All right, maybe not all of the people. The lower classes were still mostly kept out of politics, but the Senate was worried about the middle class, the people who could actually make a difference, the people who elected the tribunes and passed legislation. And sure enough, when Sulla arrived in Rome with his 30,000 soldiers, the crowds cheered. The Senate panicked. How had they not seen this coming? Sure, Sulla had threatened to march on Rome before, but everyone had just laughed it off. What did he think he was gonna do? Actually attack Rome? The Senate had too much power. The people loved the generals. They were invincible. This was Rome. But they shouldn't have been so confident, because this was also the Roman Republic, a government that survived for centuries by kicking the can down the road, and sometimes the can kicked back. Sulla marched his troops into the city and set up camp near the Forum. Then he sent a message to the Senate. You guys are making me do this. Oh, and by the way, I'm naming this guy Dictator. The Senate laughed. Who did this guy think he was? A king. But then they stopped laughing, because this was serious. And getting serious meant it was time to run away. One by one, the senators slipped out of the city and headed north to the Etruscan port of Pisa. There they met with the consul who had command of Rome's legions, and told him to arrest Sulla and bring him back to Rome. But the consul didn't want to do that. He had commanded legions himself, and he knew how powerful a popular general could be. Plus, he liked Sulla, so while he agreed to capture Sulla, he also secretly let him know that he wasn't going to arrest him. Sulla's response was swift. That night, as the soldiers were preparing to leave, they opened every man's chest and removed the bars from their weapons. When they found a bar, they broke Italiano in half and threw it in the fire. Then they locked up the camp and waited. The next morning, they opened the gates and marched into the city. Armed with iron and daggers, thousands of soldiers swept through the streets of Rome, seizing property from the wealthy landowners who had fled to the countryside. They took the senators' homes, their fields, their villas and their farms, and gave them to the poor. The consuls realized that it was too late to stop Sulla. Instead, he was leading a revolution. The first civil war in Roman history had just begun. They say that Julius Caesar came from humble beginnings, but he wasn't born in a stable, and neither was Augustus. In fact, he was born into a completely different family. All right, now things are getting tense. The soldiers are quietly advancing on the city, and the senators are fleeing. It's almost like a horror movie. Let's slow things down a bit. The year is 87 BC, and after a long and complicated series of events that I won't bore you with, two men find themselves in charge of Rome, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. See, after Sulla marched his troops on Rome and kicked off the First Roman Civil War, he got sick of fighting and went back to his villa in the countryside. For a while, it seemed like the Senate would win, but then Marius came along, got popular with the people, and seized control of the city. Then Sulla came back and kicked him out. And now he is staking his revenge by chasing the last remnants of Marius's army out of the city. And if he can catch them, he'll execute them all, but not before giving them a chance to surrender and live. It's late at night, and the streets are dark and empty. Tensions are high as the soldiers advance slowly and cautiously. Suddenly, one of them hears movement ahead. Is it a trap? He calls out, but there's no reply. He motions with his finger for the rest of the soldiers to halt, and then creeps forward to investigate. As he moves, the sound grows louder. Is it a wild animal? Maybe. Just as he gets closer, something jumps out and knocks him to the ground. Before he can react, several more jump out and surround him. With swords drawn, they demand to know who he is and what he's doing here. The soldier hesitates, unsure how to respond. Finally, he speaks up. I'm a soldier in Sulla's army. I was just taking orders when suddenly the ground begins to shake beneath their feet. What's that noise? One of the soldiers shouts. Is it an earthquake? No, It's worse than that. Another replies, it's the Praetorian Guard. They're coming for us. They've found where we're hiding. We need to move now. But where can they go? They've surrounded the entire area. There's nowhere to hide. The soldiers exchange uneasy glances. They're trapped, and they know it. But just as they're about to give up, one of them spots a small opening in the wall. It's barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, but it's their only chance. So they do it anyway. They emerge on the other side of the wall and make their way through the darkness. They don't know where they're going, but they know they have to keep moving. Suddenly, they hear the sound of shouting and fighting in the distance. Could this be the end? Will they finally be caught? Or will they make it to safety? Find out next time. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it might have fallen in one. If you liked this episode, check out this playlist for more adventures from ancient Rome. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. And if you have, please subscribe again. It really helps us out. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. And yes, we are still doing the Jugurthine series. I know it's been a while since season 3 aired, but hey, better late than never. Am I right? Anyway, let's get into this episode. Okay, now where did we leave off last time? Yes. So Marius had just given a rousing speech about how he was really a dictator. And he was actually super duper worried about what would happen when Sulla came back from the east. And so he ordered the Senate to pass a law that forbade Sulla from ever holding elected office again. This way, if Sulla came back, there would be no position for him to take except the one Marius had graciously offered him earlier. Just kidding. It wasn't gracious at all. It was an ultimatum basically saying either take this proconsular command or get the hell out of Rome. So with everything settled, Marius set about putting down the revolt in Asia Minor, while Sulla took his legions east to restore order in the province of Greece. In 83 BCE, Sulla restored his command in Greece and set sail for the Hellespont, which is modern-day East. There he spent some time raising money and getting ready for his campaign against Mithridates. Back in Rome, everything began to fall apart. People were going crazy because they couldn't agree on who should be consul for 82 BC since Marius held sole command of the Italian legions. He could have easily seized the consulship by force, but he didn't want to resort to that just yet. But others weren't as patient as Marius. The most notable of these men was Gaius Norbanus, who ran for consul and won. He also chose not to take Marius's advice and flee to the south. Instead, he stayed in Rome and tried to raise an army to fight against the Marian reforms. As soon as he heard about Norbanus's election, though Marius got spooked and decided to grab power for himself, he declared himself dictator and began seizing property from his enemies and giving it to loyal supporters. Now normally, you'd think that this would have outraged the Roman people and sparked a revolution, but they were actually pretty cool with it. The reason why? Well, the land reform Marius enacted as part of the agrarian law freed a lot of poor Romans from debt bondage, which made them very popular. That, coupled with Marius's previous reputation as a great general, well, it led to the majority of Romans thinking, maybe being a dictator isn't such a bad idea. Now, to be fair, history does have a funny way of repeating itself. And if you thought this situation would end well, then boy oh boy, do I have news for you. Back to Sulla, though. When he heard that Marius had declared himself dictator, he got really pissed. As soon as he crossed into Macedonia, he began his campaign by sacking 2 cities, Demetrius and Pydna. Both cities had opposed Rome and supported Perseus, so they got punished. Sulla then moved south and defeated a small force of Mithridatic troops near the city of Thermopylae, which was apparently guarded by a small garrison of Marian supporters. You know, the ones who refused to leave Rome and die, like good little Caesar's citizens. After taking the city, Sulla executed the garrison along with anyone else he suspected of being loyal to Marius. After dealing with those pesky Marians, Sulla focused on securing the rest of Greece. Now, while he was doing this, something happened in Rome that was going to change everything. See, while Norbanus was consul, he kept trying to recruit soldiers for his anti-Marian army. However, every time he approached a military tribune to get them to defect from Marius's army, they would refuse until suddenly this guy named Lucius Cornelius Sulla showed up. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Wait, isn't that the same Cinna that helped Marius overthrow Sulla and become dictator? Yeah, Yeah, it is. And here's the thing. While Cinna was in Greece, he was only a simple soldier. But back in Rome, he had friends and family who were very influential. His father and brother were both senators, and his sister was married to none other than Gaius Marius. And you know what you call someone like that? A snake. Seriously. Like, seriously. Seriously, a snake. Because when Norbanus asked him to raise troops for his cause, he agreed. And when he went to Marius to ask for the same thing, guess what he said? Yeah, he guessed it, he agreed. But behind the scenes, Cinna was playing both sides, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When Sulla was secure in Greece, news arrived in Rome that he had executed 2 Roman hosters. These executions angered many Romans, especially Marcus Livius Drusus, who wanted revenge, so he convinced Norbanus to attack Sulla. Unfortunately, Norbanus didn't want to just yet. He was afraid that if he launched a premature attack, Sulla would raise an army in the east to march on Rome. So he told Drusus to wait until the next year. However, Drusus was impatient, and he didn't want to wait until next year. He assembled a group of armed thugs and killed Norbanus, declaring himself. Now normally, this would have been a huge deal, but it wasn't. Why? Well, because while this was happening, Cinna returned to Rome with his army, and as soon as he arrived, he marched on the city and forced Drusus to commit suicide. Once that was done, he entered the city and handed over power to none other than, wait for it, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Okay, let me pause this episode real quick to ask you a question. Do you want to see more historical stories? Do you want to learn about ancient Rome, medieval Japan, World War II? Well, if you do, then check out my new channel. It's literally called Crash Course, and I cover all sorts of history there. Okay, now back to the episode. So now we have 2 dictators in Rome, Cinna and Marius. And they wasted no time in cracking down on Sulla's supporters. They prescribed lists of nobles and wealthy landowners and confiscated their property, and then they shared it among Cinna and Marius's supporters. And let me tell you, this was super unpopular. Everyone hated it, even the people who benefited from it. Anyway, seeing this, Sulla knew he had to come back to Rome immediately. So he raced across Greece and made it to Italy by 82 BC, however. Once he arrived, he had a little bit of a problem. The seas were very rough, and he lost most of his baggage, which included his list of allies and reinforcements. So now he's in Italy, but he doesn't know who supports him or who doesn't. To make matters worse, while he was gone, Cinna and Marius had crushed a revolt in Africa and gained control of the province. So now Sulla has to go back to Greece to regroup, and let me tell you, he was not happy about this. But there was nothing he could do. He had to go. So he set sail back to Greece and left his deputy Quintus Lucretius Ofela in charge of his army in Italy. Meanwhile, Cinna and Marius were in North Africa, securing their new gains. They divided the province between themselves, with Marius taking control of Numidia and Cinna taking control of the rest. However, they had a big disagreement over who should be the supreme commander of the Roman army. Cinna thought it should be him, obviously, because he was Cinna, and he thought he deserved it. But Marius was like, no way, man, I am the greatest general of all time. I am the man who single-handedly defeated the Germanic tribes and rescued Rome. I am Rome, and therefore, I should be in charge. So they argued and argued, but no one could convince the other to back down, which meant things were going to have to be settled on the battlefield. So they met near the city of Carthage in 81 BC and clashed armies. Now, to be honest, I do want to really know the details of this battle, because history is kind of vague on that point. What we do know, though, is that it was a total disaster for Marius. His army lost badly, and he barely escaped with his life. In fact, he probably would have died if he hadn't gotten help from one unlikely source, his wife, Julia. See, after the battle, Marius fled to the city of Cirta, and Julia followed him there. She then invited the local chieftain to her house and seduced him. Then she stole his horse and gave it to Marius, which allowed him to escape and live to fight another day. But while Julia was busy playing the field, Cinna was marching on Rome. He crossed the Alps with his army and began his campaign by besieging the city of Aqu. Now, as soon as Sulla heard about this, he knew he had to hurry up and get back to Italy. So, he did. And in the meantime, We can only imagine how awesomely he rode into Italy. Can you picture it? The crowd cheering, birds cawing, children playing, puppies frolicking as Sulla rides triumphantly into town on a white horse. You know, because he's awesome like that. Anyway, I'll pick up the story right after the credits roll. So with Marius defeated in Africa and Cinna marching on Rome, Sulla's return was looking more and more likely every day. But before he could make his move, he had to secure his eastern provinces. You see, when he left a man named Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo in charge of his legions in the east. However, after hearing about Cinna's victory over Marius, Strabo switched sides and began attacking Sulla's allies. To make things worse, the allies Sulla needed to defeat Strabo were busy campaigning against Mithridates. So now Sulla is stuck between a rock and a hard place. He needs to defeat Strabo, but his potential allies are fighting a bigger war. Well, as it turns out, he didn't need any allies. Strabo was defeated at the Battle of Orchomenius in Boeotia, and he fled to Athens, where he committed suicide. And that, my friends, is where we're going to end this episode. All right, I hope you enjoyed that one, and I hope you're excited for the next episode. If you are, then hit that like button and let me know in the comments what your favorite part of the episode was. Also, if you want to see more from me, then check out my new channel. I make fun history videos over there, too. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. So we're back in the Mediterranean for this episode. And while Rome was dealing with civil war at home, another one was brewing in the east against King Mithridates, the 6th of Pontus. So, let's talk about it. This is part 8 of our series on the history of Rome. We'll be discussing events that take place around 87 to 83 BCE. The Roman Republic, under the leadership of Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, were fighting the Third Mithridatic War against King Mithridates the 6th of Pontus. As always, this video is based on history. Comes comprehensive timeline on the Third Mithridatic War, which is absolutely fantastic, by the way. So, check it out. There's a link below. But just a quick reminder before we dive in. We've got a second channel. So, if you love what we do here and want to see more from us, please consider following over there. There'll be some fun stuff coming up later this year that I know my fans are really going to enjoy. Anyway, let's get into it. Okay, so we left off last time with the Romans essentially being pushed out of most of Greece and Asia Minor after the Battle of Chaeronea. In response, Rome would lay siege to Athens, and Sulla would relieve the city after a 5-month siege. The Athenians switched sides because they were sick of Pontic rule. But not before Pontic King Mithridates executed 2,000 Athenian nobles who refused to surrender. The next year in 86 BCE, Sulla would capture the important city of Orchomenius and defeat the Pontic king his son in a battle nearby. But these victories didn't end the war. In fact, it would go on for several more years. The Pontic king was still very much in the fight. In 85, a general named Archelaus led an army of 120,000 men to invade Greece proper, burning several cities along the way. He then retreated to the Peloponnese, where he met up with a fleet of 200 ships from Armenia under the command of Tigranes II. Together they marched north toward central Greece, hoping to trap the Romans between two armies. This plan failed, however, when Archelaus's soldiers mutinied due to poor treatment, killing their officers, including the general himself. Meanwhile, news came that Mithridates had died suddenly, supposedly by the bite of a poisonous snake, though rumors spread that it was actually poisoned by his own wife. Either way, his son, also named Mithridates, took over the throne and tried to sue for peace, offering to return all the plunder taken from Roman territories in Asia Minor, if the Romans would grant him the lands his father had conquered there. Rome rejected this offer outright, and even recalled the envoy sent to relay it back to Pontic king, probably because they didn't trust anything the Pontic royal family said anymore. Sulla was now free to raise a new levy and begin his campaign in Asia Minor. In late 84, he seized the important Pontic port of Sinope and used it to supply his army. That same year Sulla moved west into Phrygia, defeated another Pontic army, and captured the city of Ankara. Now, this was important for two reasons. First, It secured a supply line back to Sinope. And second, it allowed him to pillage the countryside for plunder to pay his troops. See, the Roman army wasn't paid like professional soldiers today. They were volunteers who served for a set period of time, and veterans were expected to use their pay to buy land and retire. But this meant that the Roman army was dependent on plunder for its continued service. If they weren't paid, they wouldn't fight. And Sulla knew this, so he made sure his campaigns went through rich areas, so that he could keep his troops happy. His first opportunity to do this came when he invaded Cappadocia, the kingdom just south of Pontus. The local king, Ariamnes, fled to the Pontic court for help, and Mithridates did send an army to rescue him. 60,000 strong, under the command of two generals, B04 and Belisariquatro. Sulla ambushed them in the mountains and defeated them. Then he turned his attention to the king of Armenia, Tigranes, who had sent a fleet to relieve Athens earlier in the war. Sulla pursued Tigranes to the city of Nicaea and laid siege to it. After capturing the city, he sacked it, selling captives and plundering the king's palace. He reportedly filled 4,000 talent ships with gold, silver, statues, and other valuables from the city, and sent them back to Rome. With all this treasure, Sulla was able to pay his troops and recruit even more to his legion. He then advanced on the city of Zela, defended by a force of 3,000 under the command of the Pontic general Belisariquatro. Sulla surprised his enemy and utterly defeated them. It was during this battle that the famous Roman general's crossing maneuver originated. According to Plutarch, who says Sulla ordered a river to be dug across the battlefield to split the Pontic forces in two. While whether or not this story is true is disputed, the battle was indeed significant. It established Sulla's reputation as a brilliant military commander, although a harsh one, since he showed no mercy to the defenders of Zyla, killing or enslaving all of them. He even confiscated the pay of those in the city who were expecting payment from the Pontic treasury, claiming they were deserted their posts and fled the city without permission. This battle marked the turning point in the war. Only 3 more battles would be fought, each resulting in a decisive Roman victory. The first of these took place near the city of Orchomenus in central Greece. Sulla faced down an army of 60,000 Pontics and easily defeated them. According to Appian, the Pontic cavalry charged too quickly and was routed by Sulla's light infantry. Their infantry followed too closely behind the cavalry, and they could unform their ranks in time to repel the Roman attack. All told, Appian claims that 4,500 Pontic soldiers were killed. Sulla then moved into Thrace, defeating a rebel king there who had allied himself with Pontic. The grateful Roman Senate awarded Sulla with a triumph after this victory and granted him the right to celebrate with a parade in Rome. This parade, however, never happened. See, Sulla had grand plans for his victory celebrations. He wanted to lead a procession of 6,000 pairs of gay male lovers through the streets of Rome, celebrating his victory over the unnatural vices of the East. The Roman Senate, however, had other ideas and vetoed the plan. What is? Interesting is that Plutarch claimed this was because Sulla had outraged Roman morals by prostituting women in taverns and brothels while he was campaigning, which the Senate wanted to punish. But Appian makes it clear that the real reason was that the Senate didn't approve of Sulla's plan to marry one of his female slaves. So there you have it, proof that Roman emperors may have been more sexually liberated than we sometimes give them credit for. Anyway, moving on. The final battle of the war took place near the city of Chaeronea. Here Sulla faced off against another huge Pontic army of 70,000 foot soldiers and 6,000 horsemen. Sulla was outnumbered almost 4-1, but the Pontic king's brother, B04, didn't take advantage of this opportunity. Instead, he attacked Hadon and was repelled by the disciplined Roman legions. After the battle, the Roman Senate declared Sulla dictator and awarded him a second triumph. For this victory, Sulla went back to Asia Minor once again and confiscated vast amounts of property from the cities he considered disloyal. Sucus Athens, he levied another army and marched east to conquer the kingdom of Bithynia and the kingdom of Pontus itself. When he returned to Rome in 82 BCE, his 8 years of campaigning had made him a wealthy man, not to mention famous. His total plunder is believed to have reached nearly $500 million. By the time Sulla's career was finished, Aades single-handedly won the war against Mithridates and established the authority of the Roman Republic throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Although his victories had been impressive, The cost in lives had been tremendous. The Third Mithridatic War is estimated to have killed 2 million Romans and 4 million people in the East. Whether this high death toll is accurate is debatable. Ancient historians often exaggerated casualty numbers. But either way, the war had exhausted Italy and the provinces alike. And although Sulla was a great general, his brutal tactics and blatant disregard for Roman law and tradition made him deeply unpopular in Rome. After establishing the Sullan dictatorship, he began a program of proscriptions, having his political enemies put to death and seizing their property to pay his veterans. Although his regime was short-lived, lasting only a few years, Sulla had fundamentally altered the relationship between the Roman generals and the Senate and paved the way for the rise of Augustus. And that's it for this video. Let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments below. Was Sulla a hero or a villain? And should we be judging him by modern standards or considering the standards of the ancient world? Let me know your thoughts below. Also, make sure to follow if you haven't already. And thanks to our supporters. Finally, don't forget to check out our second channel for some fun stuff coming soon. I've been your host. Remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was built by Romans. Civil war has broken out again. Marusi is dead, but his followers, they're still fighting. And now Rome itself is being threatened by these so-called Mariani. Can Sulla defend himself? Can he defend his supporters? And most importantly, can he win the war? Whoa, let's find out. This is 9. Return to Italy. The Second March on Rome, 83 to 82 BCE. It is hard to imagine a Roman general more unpopular than Sulla. His record was that of a professional soldier with not one successful campaign to his name. He had raised an army in the east, defeated his political opponents, marched into the heart of Italy, and then crushed the last remnants of resistance against him. It was now only 16 kilometers from the city gates, but he had done nothing to prepare for its defense. It would be a disaster if he lost it. The first attacks came from inside. Entire legions were defecting, joining the Marian side because they didn't want to fight fellow Italians. Some even claimed that they were being forced to serve under Sulla. But this could not be true because no one forces a Roman citizen to join the army. They were there because they wanted to be there. They'd enlisted themselves. That was their choice. However, when news reached them about how brutal Sulla had been towards Rome and its people, well, their enthusiasm to fight for him evaporated. Now, they did not just defect. They brought their weapons with them. So when they switched sides, they became a deadly threat indeed. To make matters worse, Gaius Norbanus, who had fled to Rome after defeating the Samnites, was accused of betraying them all. So the other Italian allies, they stopped fighting. They looked at what happened to their ally and concluded that the best strategy was to surrender. Soon, all of central Italy was in the hands of the Marsians. Sulla was surrounded, then everything went wrong. His supply lines were cut. His troops were demoralized. Defections continued. All hope seemed to be lost until the arrival of reinforcements. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus arrived with 2 legions from Spain and Marcus Licinius Crassus with 4 legions from Greece. This saved Sulla, but he was still in big trouble. To save his skin, he needed to take Rome. And as he marched on the city, he faced some pretty big battles, like the Battle of the Colline Gate. These are very difficult to describe. They're always just so chaotic. There are hordes of men clashing together. There are cavalry charges. Lots of noisy blood. It's messy. I mean, look at this artwork. We can see men hacking each other to pieces, but we can also see the peaceful countryside around them. It's almost idyllic, and yet right in the middle of it, there is a battle taking place. It's like oil and water mixing together. How do you describe something that is so chaotic but is set in such a serene environment? How do you do it without sounding stupid? Well, perhaps the best way to describe the Battle of the Colline Gate, or any battle, really, is simply to not describe the battle at all, but instead to focus on one person, one single soldier. You know, imagine yourself there. Imagine yourself in the thick of the action. What would you see? What would you smell? What would you hear? That's exactly what I'll try to do here. I will take you to the front line and put you in the center of the action. Then when you come back, when you snap out of it, Hopefully I have done my job and the battle will live on in your mind long after the video is over. Let's go to the Colline Gate. Here goes nothing. We are on the Appian Way, the road that leads to Capua. All around us, soldiers are readying themselves for the attack. They're shouting, they're yelling, they're getting ready. Nearby, the general gives the signal. Our soldiers, those we've been following since the beginning of this story, they rise to the challenge. They form ranks, they grab their shields, and they charge. It's loud. We can hear the clash of metal on metal, shouts of pain and screams of anger. Men are falling left and right. Some of our soldiers are knocked off their feet. Others continue charging ahead. We get closer to the gate. We can see the enemy commander struggling to hold his ground. Our men are falling, but our men are also breaking through. We push on. We want to get inside. We want to plunder the city. There are shouts of victory, but it's too early to celebrate. The battle isn't over yet. There are thousands of Romans defending the city. The general tells us to pull back. He wants to regroup. We pull back, but the enemy is pursuing us. We reform the ranks. We fight off the cavalry. Finally, the general gives the order. We charge once more. This time it's personal. It's every man for himself. The gates are broken. We're entering the city. We can see the general leading the way. He's brave. He's strong. He's determined. He cuts down the enemy commander and plants his standard on the gate. We cheer. We are victorious. That was quite the experience, wasn't it? Quite the battle. Well, that was just one of many. Sulla had to fight his way block by block through Rome. One story goes that he was almost killed in a house by a woman who threw a roof tile at him. He survived, and he took the city. He punished Rome severely for supporting his enemies. 400 senators and 200 equestrians were put to death. Thousands more went into exile, and so Sulla was master of Rome. He had triumphed, but not everyone agreed. While his opponents were gone from Rome, he had taken control of the city government, and he had reformed the Senate by kicking out the old elite and replacing them with new, more loyal senators. But now the real work began. He needed to pacify Italy. The civil war was over, but now he had to rule over the country he had just devastated. This proved to be extremely difficult. In fact, it was impossible. For one thing, his armies were exhausted, and they refused to march further. They had just fought a terrible civil war, and they wanted to go home and get on with their lives. Sulla knew that he couldn't force them anymore. They'd already given him everything they had. But there was one solution. He could use intimidation. Remember that massive army he'd assembled at the beginning of this conflict? The one that had marched into Italy? Well, he had kept it intact. Sure, some of its members had defected and joined the other side, but most of them were still there. And if he marched them across Italy, well, that would definitely scare his opponents into submission. And that is exactly what he did. So in 82 BCE, he used his army to intimidate the recalcitrant Italian states. He had them surrounded. He threatened them with violence. And when they submitted, he marched his army home. There is no point in keeping 10,000 soldiers in the field if you just want to threaten a small town, right? After all, you only need a few hundred for that. By doing this, he crushed all major opposition to his reforms. The other Italian states realized that they could not defeat him in battle, nor could they persuade his soldiers to switch sides, so they had no choice but to submit. And thus, Sulla had pacified Italy. Now, we should not conclude just yet, though. Not at all. It's important to remember that although Sulla had defeated his opponents in battle, that did not mean that he'd won the hearts and minds of the population. No, not at all. Most Italians hated him. They called him a tyrant. They said that he destroyed the Roman constitution. They hated him for ending the Republic. Whether or not that was true doesn't matter here. The facts are that he had become extremely unpopular and he was going to leave Rome soon. He was leaving to start his well-deserved retirement. But before he left, he did one last horrible thing. He proscribed his enemies, meaning that he declared them outlaws, and this gave his soldiers a free pass to rob them of their property and to kill them. Many senators were killed. Even Gaius Marius, the younger, was executed. This was not a great way to end a civil war. Still, Sulla had defeated his opponents. He had saved Rome, and he had become master of the city. Now he could retire, enjoy the spoils of war, and never set foot in Italy again. Maybe that's where it all went wrong. Because he was supposed to keep reforming Rome. He was supposed to help her recover from the civil war. But he left, and that's why it never happened. Instead, Rome entered a period of chaos. Generals kept marching on the city, trying to take power for themselves. And civil wars kept erupting. Still, that's a story for another day. Today, we celebrate Sulla. He won the civil war. He was master of Rome. If it wasn't for him, Italy might not exist today. And that is why he is one of our heroes of history. Thank you for watching. Hello friends. Welcome to this channel. Today we're going to look at 10. Sulla as dictator. A new precedent in Roman history in 82 BCE. We are moving through the year-by-year chronicle of Roman history that I began in the previous video. So if you want to know more about what was happening in 82 BCE, you'll find that link in the description. Also, if you haven't seen my overview of the late Republic, you can click here for that now. So let's get started. First, a quick review. Marius had died in 86 BCE, after being appointed to the consulship for a record 7th time. Soon after, Sulla marched into Rome with his victorious army and took control of the city. He then left to deal with Mithridates, the 6th in the east, leaving the administration of Rome to his colleague Gaius Marius the Younger, who would be co-consul until the end of the year. Sulla returned to Rome only in 83 and entered the city as the first Roman general since the Dictator Cinna 40 years earlier. He then used his power to exact revenge on his enemies and restore order to Rome. The Optimate Party, which he led, triumphed over the Populares and their champion, Gaius Marius the Younger, who fled to Africa, and yet another civil war seemed imminent. But suddenly Sulla fell ill and died 3 months later. But why? In today's video, we are going to examine how Sulla came to be appointed dictator for life, breaking with all traditions of the office and making himself a virtual king of Rome. Now, if you've been watching this series from the beginning, you might remember me discussing the powers of the dictator. It is an office which traditionally held the highest authority in the Roman state, but was temporary in nature, intended to be used for crises, and to last no longer than 6 months. Furthermore, every dictator was required to swear an oath to uphold the constitution, which meant that even though they had plenary power to make laws, they still had to work within the bounds of the existing constitution. However, there were a few exceptions to this rule. 2 famous instances come to mind: Nemesis Cinna in 87 BCE, and Augustus in 23 or 22 BC. Cinna, like Sulla, held the title Dictator Perpetuo, though he too had subsequently died. Augustus, on the other hand, retained the title Dictator until his death, but it seems that he did not exercise the powers attached to it in the way that Sulla did. Now, whether Sulla was the first to break with this tradition of the office is disputed. The short answer is that it depends on how you define first. If you mean that he was the first dictator to hold the title Dictator Perpetuo, then the answer is no. That honor belongs to Cinna, as I mentioned a moment ago. However, if you mean that he was the first to use the power of the dictatorship to institute far-reaching constitutional reforms, then the answer is yes. This is because both Livy and Plutarch, our primary sources for this period, tell us that Sulla used his dictatorial power to reform and change Rome in ways that no dictator had done before him. And so when we study Sulla, the term first should always be qualified. In one case, the point is that Sulla was determined to change the nature of the dictatorship and remake the Roman constitution in his own mold. But before we get into his prescriptions and constitutional reforms, I think it would be helpful to clear up some misconceptions about Sulla's appointment as dictator. For one thing, despite what you read in the title, there is absolutely no evidence that Sulla wanted to be appointed dictator. In fact, he resisted being appointed to the position on several occasions. This is because Sulla, unlike many Romans, understood what such a title meant, namely, that he would be outside the constitution. and this was something that he clearly wanted to avoid. He knew full well that being appointed dictator would make him a target, not just from the populares, but also from the Optimates, who would see him as a threat to the Republic. In fact, this is exactly what happened after his first consulship in 88, when he was forced to flee Rome. Furthermore, when he was appointed dictator in 82, he did everything he could to avoid entering the city with that title. It was only when he learned that Metellus was appointed to co-dictatorship with him that he decided to return. Even then, he made it clear that he did not want to hold the title of dictator, saying to those who welcomed him, "You seem to me to be celebrating the return of a king rather than that of a private citizen." He then went on to say that he would hold the dictatorship only so long as he had to, insisting that he hated the title and longed to be rid of it. However, when he finally gave up the dictatorship, it was not to appoint a colleague as his co-dictator, but rather to appoint himself perpetual dictator. What gives? Well, to understand what happened here, we need to remember that Rome had two chief magistrates, the consuls, at the end of their term in office. They would appoint a colleague as co-consul, and thereby ensure that their power would not cease abruptly. This practice allowed for a seamless transition of authority, and it also prevented any potential rivals from getting control of the consulship through force. Sulla's situation was somewhat different. However, because he had no intention of retiring from public life, at least not anytime soon. Therefore, when he gave up the dictatorship, he left open the office of consul, and by doing so, he set in motion a constitutional crisis. This was because there was no provision in Roman law for an individual to hold both the consulship and the dictatorship at the same time. According to Plutarch, when the tribunes tried to prevent this by refusing to register Sulla's consulship, he responded by having him put to death. And that is the key to understanding how Sulla came to be appointed dictator. You see, the existing constitution provided for a peaceful transfer of power from one consul to the next, but it did not provide for the situation in which a consul refused to relinquish power. Therefore, when the tribunes tried to prevent Sulla from holding both offices, they were working within the confines of the constitution, and when Sulla had them killed, he was breaking the constitution. To put it bluntly, Sulla's appointment as Dictator Perpetua was a direct result of his unconstitutional behavior. His refusal to relinquish the consulship forced the Senate to find a legal solution to the problem, and they ultimately decided to do away with the office of consul altogether. They declared that it was vacant and that the powers of the consulship would be transferred to Sulla as dictator. And so we have the first dictator for life in Roman history. But that was not all. As I said earlier, Sulla had been named dictator because he had broken the constitution. And now that he was dictator for life, he felt empowered to remake the constitution in his own mold. This is why the remainder of his tenure as dictator was spent instituting a series of sweeping reforms designed to change the very nature of Roman government. We will examine these prescriptions in detail in the next video, so be sure to look for that link in the description below. In the meantime, if you want to know more about ancient Rome, please check out the links in the description. Remember to subscribe so that you never miss a video. Thanks for watching. Until next time. The year is 49 BC. You're strolling through the Forum in Rome, perhaps running some errands or catching up with a friend. What a pleasant day it is too. The sun is shining, birds are tweeting. Life is good. Suddenly, you hear a commotion coming from the nearby basilica. Curiously, you make your way over to see what is going on. You find a crowd gathered around two men who are reading out a list. They are reading out a list of names. As they do, people in the crowd wince, covering their mouths in shock when their name is called. But why? What are these men reading? And what is so shocking about it? The answer to that question is this. This is an explanation of prescriptions. Basically, a list of enemies of the state marked for death. It is a hot summer-esque day, and the men read out the names of those whose property has been confiscated by Caesar. For many of those listening, this is the first time they have heard of the fate that has befallen their friends and family. Some had suspected something was amiss when armed soldiers arrived at their house that morning, carrying off their valuables and sealing up their property. Now, though they know the truth, their worst fears are confirmed. Those who owned property in the city had their houses sealed off and guarded by armed men. Now, it's clear why. Those named here are dead. It's no accident that we don't have any records written by the people being persecuted here. The prescriptions were designed to terrify the population into submission, and one of the ways they did that was by making sure that the prescriptions were public. Let's learn more about what these lists of names were all about. If you enjoy this episode and want to help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers, be sure to subscribe. We also encourage you to leave a comment below with your ideas for future episodes. We may even feature your comment in a future episode. Proscription was a Roman legal term which evolved into a list of names of individuals who were outlawed and declared enemies of the state. They could be charged with virtually anything the government wanted to charge him with, such as treason, plotting against the state, or disrespecting the head of state. However, often the charges were trumped up and were used as a means to get rid of potential rivals or anyone who opposed the government. That was certainly true in this case. Caesar was in a paranoid mood. His power was challenged both by the nobility and by his own allies. He began proscribing his enemies in 49 BC during the civil war with Pompey, and then continued after he came out victorious. In total, somewhere between 120 and 150 people were proscribed. Most of them were senators, but not all. 2 of Caesar's former allies, Marcus Junius, Brutus, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, were also placed on the list, and even Caesar's own mother was proscribed. She was only taken off the list once she had handed over her son Escilor after the famous assassination in the Senate. Once the proscription lists were published, usually posted on public buildings or read aloud in the forum like we see here, the proscribed individuals could be killed by anyone and their property confiscated. It was perfectly legal to kill them. It was encouraged by the government. These proscriptions created a climate of fear and terror throughout Rome. People became suspicious of their neighbors, friends, and family members. A proscribed person could still defend himself, but if he was caught, he would be put to death. So really, there was no defense against it. When they were proscribed, their fate was sealed. It doesn't sound like much of a stretch to say that proscriptions were a form of state-sponsored terrorism. The whole point of them was to strike terror into the hearts of the population. After all, the aim of the government was not to punish the guilty, as we understand it, but rather to intimidate everyone else into submission. How did people react to these proscriptions? Many people were so terrified that they fled Rome. Others hid away in their homes, locking themselves in and hoping they wouldn't be found. Still others tried to flee abroad, but they were stopped at the border by armed guards. Soldiers were stationed throughout the city to prevent the flow of refugees. The proscriptions were a financial boon to Caesar, who needed money to maintain his army and to pay back the loans he had taken out to raise it. By confiscating the property of the proscribed, he raised enough money to keep his army in the field for several years. Of course, it didn't just be the proscribed who suffered financially. When Caesar seized a property, whether its owner was alive or dead, the people living on it, usually slaves or tenants, lost their homes and livelihoods. And don't think for a second that it was only the proscribed and their families who suffered during the proscriptions. Anyone who wasn't careful could end up on one of those lists. Maybe you knew someone who was charged with plotting against Caesar. Or maybe you were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. You could be arrested, put on trial, and convicted in a matter of hours. Then you would be proscribed. Your life would be forfeit, and your property would be seized. Imagine the terror of hearing your name called out and knowing that you were doomed. Imagine the uncertainty of wondering whether or not you will be proscribed next. And imagine the despair of seeing your friends and neighbors murdered in the street. All of these things happened during the proscriptions, and all of them contributed to the creation of a police state in Rome. Now, there is no evidence that the crowds here took much notice of the proscriptions when they were posted, but rather they waited for someone to tell them the news. In fact, they probably went out of their way to avoid reading the lists. We can tell this because we have evidence that people were paid to post the proscriptions in public places. People who posted the lists could be held liable if they were defaced or removed. This was not always enforced, however, and at times, people removed the proscriptions to protect their own interests. In one case, a man named Marcus Tuberus posted a proscription list in the forum and then pretended to be shocked when people complained that his list contained some very important names. He was fined 5,000 sesterces and ordered to post a copy of the list outside his house, so people could come and check to see if they were related to the proscribed individuals in any way. Overall, the proscriptions were a terrible tragedy for Rome. They led to the deaths of many innocent people and the confiscation of a great deal of wealth. They also created a climate of fear and suspicion that lasted 4 years. Luckily, they were short-lived. After Caesar's assassination, the proscriptions were abolished and Rome slowly began to return to normal. So let's finish by answering the question we posed at the beginning of this episode. Is this scene horrific? Yes. Should we be horrified by what we see here? Yes. Are we glad that it never happened in our day? Of course. But it's also important to remember that this is history. History should never be forgotten. It must be remembered and studied so that we can learn from the mistakes of the past. The proscriptions were a dark chapter in Roman history, but by learning about them, we can make sure that they never repeat themselves. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe. You can also follow us on social media for more historical tales. Thanks again for watching. Republican Rome is often painted as a time of great prosperity. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. There were plenty of problems in this era, from political corruption and instability to an ever-growing gap between rich and poor. So, how did Romans of this period attempt to solve these issues? We'll tackle that question today and answer it by looking at how one Roman leader sought to rewrite the rules of the Republic. This is the 12th episode of my series on the history of political campaigning, and today we're going to be looking at how ancient Rome did political reform. When Gaius Marius took the consulship for the 7th time in 104 BC, he had been in politics long enough to know every trick in the book. He used clientelism, secured the support of powerful allies, even unleashed his own private army of mercenaries to try and outmaneuver his opponents. But when all was said and done, it was clear that Marius was going to need more than just political savvy. If he was going to save Rome from itself, it was time to play the long game. Now, let me be clear here. Marius wasn't trying to be Augustus and set up a dictatorship, but what he did attempt to do was ensure that the Republic would work better, at least for him and those like him. And to that end, he proposed a series of reforms to the system that would change the way Rome was governed forever. First, he tackled the Senate. Republicans talk a lot about fiscal responsibility and curbing big government, right? Well, under the Republic, there was a sort of informal limit on the number of senators, and that was good because senators got paid pretty well. They also received other benefits, and having too many senators meant that these spoils of the state would be divided among too many people. Marius proposed raising the number of senators to 600, and he did so with the support of his friend, the consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla. That's a name we're going to hear a lot about today. You see, while the Senate was getting richer and richer, most Romans weren't. In fact, Rome was becoming increasingly polarized between the wealthy elite and the impoverished masses. The number of very rich and very poor people was growing quickly, and this led to deep social instability. Now, you might think that doubling the size of the Senate would only make this problem worse. But Marius thought it would actually improve things. His idea was to co-opt some of the wealthy into the Senate, taking the edge off of their power and giving them a vested interest in keeping the whole system stable. Of course, being a senator was still an honor and senators still made more money than nuns, but it wouldn't be nearly as lucrative as it had been before, and that, Marius thought, was a good thing. But he didn't stop there. The tribunes of the plebs were proving to be a thorn in the side of the optimates, or the best men, as they like to call themselves, the Roman aristocrats who dominated the Senate. But why? Well, remember, tribunes were elected by the plebeians, not the Senate, and the power of the tribunes came directly from the will of the people. Since the people weren't aristocrats, this meant that the tribunes represented a different interest group than the Senate, and so they were often at odds with one another. Sometimes, the tribunes wielded their power responsibly and pushed for sensible reforms that helped the poor. Other times, though, they acted in ways that the optimates viewed as unconstitutional, like exempting certain classes of people from paying taxes. Sulla was particularly annoyed by the tribunate, because in 112 BC, he'd been running for consul and was absolutely poised to win. But then a tribune named Gaius Gracchus interfered and used his veto to block Sulla's election. So when Sulla became consul in 100 BC, along with Marius, he decided to teach those pesky tribunes a lesson. While he supported expanding the Senate, which would weaken the tribunes' power, he also wanted to limit the power of the tribunes in another way. You see, tribunes were elected annually, and that meant that they could use their office as a stepping stone to higher office. Sulla wanted to change that. He limited the number of terms a tribune could serve to one and barred anyone who had been a tribune from holding any other elected office. That wasn't all, though. Sulla also wanted to reorganize the courts and bring them more under the thumb of the Senate. Under the Republic, there were two types of courts: the courts of the magistrates and the courts of the centuries. The former were run by officials who were elected or appointed to handle a wide variety of legal matters. The latter were advisory bodies, whose members were chosen by lot from the centuries or voting districts of Rome. These advisory bodies issued non-binding opinions about legal matters and who had jurisdiction over what cases were heard, where it was kind of complicated and often ended up in legal limbo. Now, this wasn't ideal, so Sulla created a new court called the Concilium, a council of the people, which would have binding authority over cases involving violations of Roman law. And the council was packed with 180 ex-magistrates, who were loyal to the Senate and so much more dependent on the Senate for advancement. This meant that the judiciary was now firmly under the control of the ruling class, and so was one of the most important branches of government. However, Sulla didn't stop there. He reorganized the entire system of local administration throughout Italy. Before Sulla, the assemblies of the Italian allies were pretty much ignored. He reformed them, however, and began appointing magistrates to oversee them and collect taxes, much like provincial governors. But that wasn't all either. Sulla also reformed the arma. He introduced a professional standing army and took steps to ensure that the army would be loyal to the generals who commanded it, not the popular assemblies that had previously appointed them. That meant that the army was no longer subject to the fickle whims of the masses. Now, while that sounds like a good thing, remember that this was ancient Rome. And when the army was no longer beholden to the people, it was now beholden to the generals and to those who appointed them. And since the Senate had the power to appoint magistrates to positions of power, that meant that the Senate now had direct control over the armed forces. So overall, what was the effect of all these changes? Well, Sulla had succeeded in curtailing the power of the tribunes and bringing the major institutions of government under the control of the Senate. In theory, this would make the Republic more stable and efficient. In practice, though, it made it much more undemocratic, and that's a pretty important lesson to remember. Just because something is presented as being in the best interest of a country does mean it as actually true. In fact, sometimes the opposite is the case, and that's what happened here. The changes Sulla instituted actually increased inequality in Roman society and led to the demise of the Republic. But hey, at least things were stable, right? Wrong. Sulla's reforms merely papered over the cracks in the Republic, and because the root of the problem in Rome was actually the imbalance of power or the instability that accompanied it. No, the biggest issue was that the Republic was in crisis, and that's exactly what Marius and Sulla had been fighting about. You see, Rome was changing from a relatively small city-state to a massive empire. New territories and new peoples brought new wealth to Rome, but it also brought new challenges, and none of the existing institutions were equipped to deal with a situation as complex as this. The result was political chaos and instability. Marius and Sulla tried to fix this by tweaking the rules of the game, but they both failed, and that failure forced the first Roman to truly seize power in his own right. Cinna, Marius's ally, who would soon be followed by Julius Caesar and then Augustus. Had Rome changed its rules in a different direction, perhaps the Republic would have stood a better chance. But that's a topic for another day, and one that I hope we can explore together. Let me know in the comments below what sort of reforms you would have instituted if you were writing the rules of the Republic. And while you're down there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you never miss an exciting episode. I'll see you next time. De Profundis. In this episode of Ground News, we're going to look at one way the powerful can voluntarily resign their power, laying down their authority when they don't have to. We'll explore why it might be in your interest to lay down your own power. So stay. Tao. Do. Welcome to another episode of Ground News, where we analyze news stories so you can better navigate these crazy times. If you'd like to be in the know, well then subscribe so you never miss an episode. This is the story of how Sulla laid down his dictatorship. We all know what it's like. You've worked long and hard for your success, and now you finally have power and influence over others. And this is especially true if you're a leader. Now people are listening to you. They want to do things because you ask them to. And let's face it, it feels good. Well, imagine this. You've been exercising your power. Your enemies have been defeated. The state is stable, and the power that you thought would last forever has suddenly become boring. Well, maybe it's time to resign from your position of power. Let us look at the story of Rome's first dictator who ever resigned from his position of unlimited power. Cornelius Sulla was a Roman general and statesman who played a critical role in the late Roman Republic. It was also Rome's first dictator to hold absolute power over the Roman Republic, to voluntarily resign his dictatorship. Now, after decades of civil war, Sulla had defeated his political rival, Gaius Marius, and his supporters in 82 BC. By 79 BC, most of his enemies were dead, some by their own hand and others put to death by Sulla's prescriptions. The terms of his dictatorship gave him plenary powers. He could make laws, judge legal cases, and even confiscate property without Senate approval. However, although he had more than enough support to continue to exercise his power and even pass on the dictatorship to someone else, he chose to resign. In January of 78 BCE, Sulla made an unprecedented move. He marched his legions into the Roman Forum and announced that he was laying down his dictatorship. Shocked murmurs went through the crowd. The idea of a dictator resigning was unheard of, but Sulla was not done. He told the citizens of Rome that he was no longer Cornelius Sulla, the dictator. He was simply Cornelius Sulla, the former dictator, a private citizen. Then he left the city of Rome and retired to his estate. He had sent around letters beforehand to influential senators and magistrates, informing them that he was renouncing his dictatorship. This wasn't exactly a secret. Even the orator Cicero was informed about Sulla's plans 3 months before it happened. When the news broke, there was mixed reaction. While many Romans cheered at the end of the dictatorship, others feared that this unexpected turn of events would lead to instability. Sulla's decision was met with both celebration and trepidation. Supporters lauded him as a champion of the old aristocratic order, while critics decried his authoritarian rule. What led Sulla to take such a drastic step? Was it confidence, weariness, or political calculation? Let's explore each of these possibilities and find out. One reason could be confidence. Confidence in what? Well, confidence that despite ending his dictatorship, he still held enough power and influence to control Rome. He had a devoted group of supporters, Pulatus, who admired his strong leadership and achievements during his dictatorship. Additionally, he left behind a constitution that favored the equestrian class, which would likely ensure their loyalty in the future. Furthermore, he had successfully defeated his rivals, eliminating potential threats to his authority. In fact, he even wrote a history book detailing the civil wars and his role in restoring order to Rome. By presenting himself as the savior of the Republic, he solidified his reputation and legacy, ensuring that his name would live on in Roman history. Another reason for his resignation could be weariness. After years of civil war and conflict, Sulla may have simply been tired of the struggle and wanted to retire from public life. Leading a dictatorship comes with great stress and responsibility. Perhaps he felt the burden of maintaining stability and order was too great and desired a more peaceful existence. Maybe he just wanted to enjoy his wealth, his estates, and his gardens. Maybe he wanted to spend his time writing his memoirs instead of marching armies. After a lifetime of public service and political maneuvering, he may have decided it was time to step back and enjoy the fruits of his labor. It seems that this was actually the case. One of Sulla's friends found him in bed reading poetry and drinking wine, enjoying his newfound freedom. He was indeed weary and ready to call it quits. The last reason could be political calculation. Sulla may have realized that continuing to hold on to power would be increasingly difficult and risky. Dictatorships, even in ancient Rome, are never secure. There is always the risk of a rival or successor attempting to seize power. By stepping down, Sulla could present himself as magnanimous and wise, thereby gaining the respect and support of those he once ruled over. Resigning allowed him to leave the stage gracefully, avoiding the possibility of a humiliating downfall. He set the expectation that the dictatorship would end, and he ended it on his own terms. Ultimately, the reasons behind Sulla's resignation are complex and intertwined. A combination of confidence, wariness, and political calculation likely influenced his decision. Whatever the true motivation, his actions sent shockwaves throughout Roman history. There are lessons we can learn from Sulla's resignation. Sometimes it can be advantageous to voluntarily relinquish power. Holding on to power for too long can lead to complacency and a loss of touch with the people you're leading. As leaders, it is important to recognize when it is time to step back and allow new voices and perspectives to emerge. Adityonaji, resigning can help maintain one's legacy by stepping down at the height of one's power. One can avoid the mistakes and missteps that often come with clinging to power too tightly. Furthermore, resigning can be a strategic move to ensure the smooth continuation of one's goals and objectives. By leaving office, one can set the stage for a successor to carry on their work, building upon past achievements and advancing them further. However, it's important to note that not every situation calls for resignation. Leaders should carefully consider the potential consequences of relinquishing power and weigh them against the benefits. Sometimes it's crucial to stay in place and see through important initiatives, or during times of crisis, it may be necessary to hold on to power to maintain stability and continuity. For example, in business, sometimes it can be beneficial for CEOs to step down after a successful tenure. This allows for fresh leadership and new ideas to enter the company, preventing stagnation and complacency. A CEO who has led a company to great heights can maintain their legacy by stepping down gracefully and allowing the next generation of leaders to build on their accomplishments. By doing so, they can prevent their company from falling into decline and ensure its continued success. In politics, it can be wise for politicians to voluntarily resign when they've achieved their major goals, or after serving multiple terms. This allows for new leadership to emerge and address the evolving needs of their constituents. A politician who has served their country with distinction can enhance their legacy by stepping down at the right moment. Doing so, they can avoid the pitfalls of overstaying one's welcome and allow fresh perspectives to enter the political arena. In non-profit organizations, leaders who have successfully executed their mission and achieved a significant impact may choose to resign. This allows for new leaders with different skills and experiences to take the helm and continue the organization's important work. A nonprofit leader who has made a lasting difference can solidify their legacy by stepping down gracefully and allowing the next generation of leaders to build on their accomplishments. By doing so, they can ensure that their organization remains effective and relevant in addressing critical social issues. So, when is it time for you to step down? Well, that depends on a number of factors. It could be time to step down when you've reached the peak of your power and influence, and you won't want to risk losing it all. Or maybe it is time when you've accomplished your major goals and objectives. Or perhaps you've grown weary of the responsibilities of power and you just want to retire. Whatever the reason, there can be wisdom in knowing when it's time to step down. So let's ask ourselves, is it time for me to step down? Is it time for me to resign? And if so, how can I do it in a way that maintains my legacy and ensures the continuation of my goals and objectives? This is your host. Thanks for watching this episode of Ground News. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a thumbs up and leave a comment below to let us know what you think. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Stay grounded. Stay grounded. Let's go back to the villa for retirement and death of Julius Caesar. Part 14, retirement and death in Campania. 78 BCE, when Caesar was in his mid-60s, he began to slow down. He had conquered Gaul and was busy with politics in Rome, but he was also getting older and tired. So when he turned 67, he decided to have one last hurrah. In 78 BCE, Caesar had many lavish parties at his villa in Naples. The city was full of debauchery as young men and women enjoyed themselves. Even old men forgot their canes and walked with the crowd. Caesar had been through so much, and now he wanted to enjoy himself. These were some of the best years of his life. But this didn't last long because soon after, Caesar got sick. It was a horrible disease that racked his body with pain. But what exactly did Caesar die from? That is not known. Some say it was malaria, others appendicitis. We do know, however, that he suffered terribly until he died. And how did he die? Well, according to Plutarch, he soiled himself while sleeping. If it was malaria, then that would make sense. After all, you can control that sort of thing. But people often forget that Caesar was a human being, too. He had flaws and problems, just like us. And sometimes those flaws and problems could be quite embarrassing. Plutarch tells us that Caesar was staying in bed for most of the time. He had people reading to him and people cooking for him. But the more he laid in bed, the more his health deteriorated. Eventually, he had to be carried to a bathhouse. His friends helped carry him there, but they couldn't save his life. Caesar was a great warrior and statesman, but against this mysterious illness, he stood no chance. Soon enough, he passed away. So how did the Romans react to the death of their beloved leader? Did they mourn him, or were they happy to see him go? Well, some people did mourn him, especially his family and close friends, but others were just indifferent. You see, when someone is in power for a long time, they tend to get comfortable. They get used to the luxuries of life and don't want anything to change. They become afraid of the future and don't want to let go of the present. And that's what happened with Caesar. He had been in power for so long that he didn't know how to deal with retirement. He didn't know how to relax and enjoy life. So he threw these big parties, trying to fill the void inside of him. But those parties just made things worse. They reminded him of what he was missing out on and made him feel even more miserable. In the end, he died trying to recapture the glory days of his youth, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. There are a few lessons we can learn from this. First of all, we need to accept our fate. We can't fight it forever. And when it comes, we need to face it with dignity. Secondly, we should never try to recapture the past. The good old days are gone and we need to focus on the present. Finally, we must remember that even great men like Julius Caesar are human beings. They have flaws and weaknesses just like us. They make mistakes. And sometimes, those mistakes can be very embarrassing. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't admire them. In fact, it makes us admire them even more. Because it shows us that they were real people with real problems. In 78 BCE, Julius Caesar was at the height of his powers. He had just returned from a successful campaign in Gaul and was looking forward to a well-deserved rest. But fate had other plans for the Roman dictator. He would spend his final years plagued by illness and would eventually die in his villa in Campania. Although Caesar's death was a tragic loss for Rome, it also marked the end of an era. With his passing, the Republic would enter into a period of civil war and strife. That would eventually lead to the rise of the empire. The story of Julius Caesar is a fascinating one. He was a true Renaissance man, excelling in everything from military strategy to politics to literature. But he was also a ruthless dictator, who was willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. In many ways, Caesar was a product of his time. The Roman Republic was a corrupt and inefficient system that was in desperate need of reform. Caesar was able to take advantage of this and rise to the top, but he was also a victim of it. As he grew in power, he made enemies who were willing to do anything to stop him. In the end, it was these enemies who got the better of him, killing him in a fit of rage on the steps of the Senate. But Caesar's story isn't just about him. It's also about the people around him. His wife, Cleopatra, was a shrewd and intelligent woman who knew how to manipulate the Roman elite. His friend, Marcus Brutus, was a noble but misguided idealist who ultimately betrayed Caesar. And his adopted son, Octavian, was a ruthless and ambitious young man who would go on to become the first emperor of Rome. The death of Julius Caesar is one of the most famous events in history. It's been depicted in everything from plays to movies to paintings. But no matter how you tell the story, it's always a tragedy. Caesar was a great leader who was loved by his people, but he was cut down in his prime by a group of jealous senators. His death marked the end of an era for Rome, but it also ushered in a new beginning. Under Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, Rome would become an empire that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Middle East. Although Julius Caesar is dead, his legacy lives on. He's remembered as one of the greatest Roman leaders of all time, and his contributions to Rome are still felt today. His military campaigns expanded the Republic's borders, and his reforms made it more efficient and effective. He was also a great builder, and many of his projects, such as the Forum Magnum, are still standing today. Julius Caesar was a complex and controversial figure. He was a reformer and a butcher, a statesman and a tyrant. But one thing is for sure, he was a true original. He changed the course of Roman history and his impact is still felt today. We hope you enjoyed our series on the life and times of Julius Caesar. If you did, please let us know in the comments below. We'd also like to thank all of our supporters for making it possible for us to bring these videos. to you. If you'd like to support us, you can do so by following the link in the description. Thanks for watching! The year is 88 BC. Lucius Cornelius Sulla has just marched his army into Rome and established himself as dictator. He proceeds to pass a series of constitutional reforms meant to curb the power of the tribunes of the people and make the Senate more influential in the process of legislation. This would become known as the Sullan dictatorship, and after him, it be copied almost wholesale by Julius Caesar and later Augustus when he took the title of princeps. It is a huge part of the reason why we have the Roman Empire instead of the Second Republic. But like so many things that were begun in antiquity, the results weren't all that they were cracked up to be. So what was so great about Sulla's reforms? Why did they fail? And how did they influence the future of Rome? We're going to answer these questions and more today on this channel. Before we get started, a quick reminder to like this video and subscribe for more content. If you enjoy learning about history from a classical perspective, you should also check out our sister channel where we talk about all sorts of topics that are a little bit too niche or weird for this channel. For example, we just talked about the Greek and Roman ideas about self-defense, and whether there was such a thing as a right to self-defense in Roman law. So if you want to see that, go to the link in the description below. Okay, let's get back to Sulla. To understand Sulla's reforms, we first have to understand the situation that he was working with. Sulla came to power at the tail end of the so-called Late Republic, a period in ancient Rome's history defined by political instability and civil conflict. The power struggles between the various interest groups, especially the optimates, the wealthy elite landowning class, and the populares, the more democratic faction that championed the rights of the common people, had grown increasingly violent and were tearing the state apart. The two previous dictators, Marius and Cinna, both populares, had ruled with an iron fist and crushed much of their opposition. But this only emboldened Sulla, who was enough to come into Rome with his army and establish his own dictatorship in order to restore the power of the Senate. Sulla was a general, though, and generals don't really know anything about legislation. So once he was in power, he turned over most of the actual drafting of the reforms to a colleague named Gaius Cassius Longinus, who probably thought that it was a pretty cushy assignment. Most of the reforms were enacted through a series of laws which we now call the Lex Cornelia, and they dealt with several aspects of Roman politics, administration, and society. First off, he reformed the Senate itself, raising the property requirement for senators from 250,000 sesterces to 400,000, which cut down the number of senators from around 600 to 300. He also reorganized the assemblies of the tribes, which were the popular assemblies that elected magistrates and passed laws. He abolished 4 of them and combined their voting districts so that fewer voters were needed to pass a law. He then created special courts called the centumviral courts, whose members were appointed by the Senate rather than elected by the people. These courts were designed to replace the juries in the private lawsuits with panels of non-professional judges, which was controversial, because traditionally the jury system was seen as a way to protect the poor from being exploited by the rich. By replacing elected juries with appointed ones, Sulla was making it harder for ordinary citizens to get their day in court. Another big part of the reform was dealing with the tribunes of the people. Remember the tribunes? Well, if you don't, let me refresh your memory. The tribunes of the people were officials elected by the common citizens in the assemblies of the tribes. There were 2 kinds: the patrician tribunes, who were elected by the property-owning class, and the plebeian tribunes, who were elected by the poor. The main duty of the tribunes was to protect the interests of their constituents, usually by introducing laws that made life better for them. But as time went on, the tribunes became more and more radical and began passing laws that undermined the authority of the magistrates in the Senate. So Sulla took a fairly heavy-handed approach to curtailing their power. First, he forbade the tribunes from leaving Rome while their term was in office. Then he forbade them from holding meetings outside of the city. Finally, he wrote into law that any magistrate who passed a law contrary to the wishes of the tribunes could take their vote before the assembly, and if a majority approved of the law, it would stand. In effect, he was removing the veto power of the tribunes and replacing it with the veto power of the assemblies. Finally, Sulla also reformed the calendar, reorganizing the months so that every 3rd month would have 30 days. Every 2nd month would have 31, and the remaining 5 would have 29 or trentinae. also reformed the coinage and minted a new denarius, which became the standard unit of currency during the late Republic. So why did he do all this? Well, it's important to remember that Sulla wasn't motivated by ideology so much as personal interest. He wanted to be dictator, because it gave him the power to crush his enemies and solidify his own position. His reforms didn't spring from some deep desire to help the people or the Senate. They were just the means by which he could continue to hold power. Once his enemies were defeated, he lost interest in politics and retired to his estate near Naples, having completed his mission. But that doesn't mean that his reforms failed. Even though he was no longer in power, his reforms remained in place and were built upon by other dictators, most notably Julius Caesar. But unfortunately, those who followed in Sulla's footsteps didn't follow his example in terms of how to use power. After Sulla died, the power struggle between the Optimates and Populares continued unabated. The Marian and Sullan reforms were undone. By the end of the century, Caesar came to power and reinstitutionalized many of Sulla's reforms, while also pursuing policies that were closer to those of the Populares. After he was assassinated, his adopted son, Octavian, later known as Augustus, consolidated his power by cementing the Sullan reforms into law and using them as a foundation for the imperial system of government. It's a common story, really. A dictator comes along and does a bunch of stuff, but ultimately it's the institutions that they set in place that survive them and have a lasting impact on history. You can think of it like when someone dies and leaves behind a legacy. It's the legacy that lives on long after they're gone. And what Sulla left behind was a reshaped republic that was more centralized and tightly controlled by the Senate. But was it a good thing? Now, this is a tough question to answer. On the one hand, Sulla brought stability to Rome at a time when it desperately needed it. By curbing the power of the tribunes, he put an end to the violent power struggles between the Optimates and Populares. He also reformed the Senate, creating a body which was more representative of the elite class and less prone to corruption. However, his reforms also paved the way for tyranny. By taking away the power of the tribunes, he made it easier for future dictators to come along and abuse their power without any fear of reprisal. And that's exactly what happened. Caesar and Augustus ruled like kings, even though Rome was still technically a republic. In the end, Sulla's reforms were a double-edged sword. They brought stability and order to Rome, but they also paved the way for tyranny. Ultimately, the question of whether they were a good thing or a bad thing depends on your perspective. And with that, we reached the end of another episode. Let us know in the comments what you thought about Sulla's reforms, and whether you thought they were a force for good or evil in Roman history. Thank you all for listening, and a special thank you to our supporters. If you'd like to support us, please check the links in the description. Remember to like and subscribe for more content, and check out our sister podcast. And until next time, thanks for watching. And here's the thing. I always find it hard to get to sleep at night because my mind is constantly racing. There's so much stuff going on in the world and in my own life that I feel like I need to address. But if I had to guess why it happens, I would say that it is because I am trying to grapple with the same questions that human beings have been asking for millennia. What is my purpose? What should I do with my life? How should I interact with other people? Questions like this keep me up at night, but they also define the human condition.